Hello, thank you so much for joining me today for this Shochu Academy Brasil version, all about Japan's indigenous spirits and what I am going to argue are Japan's best kept secrets. I am very fortunate to be able to report to you from the Japan Sake and Shochu Makers Information Center in the center of downtown Tokyo. It's a phenomenal resource when the next time you're able to travel to Japan, and you can come here, taste through a number of beautiful products, and learn a lot more about sake, shochu, and awamori. But today, we're going to focus on the indigenous spirits from Japan, shochu and awamori. Before I get started, let me just talk a little bit about myself. My name is Chris Pellegrini, at your service. If you look me up, go ahead and tag me in anything that you're learning in this course and start a conversation. I am a writer, first of all, and I wrote the Shochu Handbook published in 2014. I also contributed to the Oxford Companion to Spirits and Cocktails, which just got published in late 2021, as well as a variety of other things, writing articles, and just basically trying to get the word out about shochu and awamori, some drinks that I am super passionate about. You will understand that very soon. I am also an educator. I have taught for years and years and years. I teach writing at a university here in Tokyo, and I am never more comfortable and more enthused than when I'm talking to people about my favorite drinks. So I love to combine my educational background with my content knowledge on shochu and awamori. And finally, I'm also an entrepreneur. I'm a very new business person. I have an export trade company in Fukuoka, Japan, which helps me to move Japan's best kept secrets out of the country. And then more recently, I have a company in New York called Honkaku Spirits that imports shochu and awamori and other koji-based spirits into the American market and also further abroad as well. So I have a lot of kind of interesting ideas and a lot of very random experiences that I hope that I can share with you today through this presentation. All right, so the way that I'm going to organize this presentation is in terms of 4 common questions that I hear all the time when I do tastings and when I do seminars, both here in Japan with either people living here or visiting here, and when I go abroad to do sales and educational activities all around the world. So question number 1 is, what are these drinks? What are shochu and awamori? Right? Question number 2 is, how are these drinks different from other spirits and other drinks around the world? How are they different from sake? How are they different from soju? How are they different from kashasa? I will get into that in detail momentarily. Question number 3 is, how are they made? All right. If you don't know about distillation, I'm going to talk about that a little bit later on. And number 4 is, how are they enjoyed? How are they served, at least in an authentic manner, here in Japan? So without further ado, let's move on to question number 1. What are they? They're good, is the simple answer. But more importantly, shochu and awamori are Japan's indigenous spirits, the country's best kept culinary secrets, and they are made all across the country. Well, shochu is anyway. And these are very strictly regulated by the Japanese government, tax office, basically, and they are very carefully protected in terms of how they can be made and how they cannot be made. Now, we're not talking about something new, some trend. We're talking 500 plus years of history. Distillation came in through, potentially through Okinawa from overseas trade centuries ago. It might have also come in through Korea or even across the sea directly from mainland China. But when the still arrived, of course, that brought lots of distilling culture with it and techniques, and new spirits were born based on the local ingredients, the agricultural products that are available, were available back then and are available still today. These are government protected. It's not moonshine, all right? And they are absolutely fascinating. One important thing before I get into ingredients is there are no additives allowed in authentic shochu and awamori production. Nothing can be added to the drink other than, well, water and thyme. That's it. That's all you can add. So there's no sweeteners added to it, no sugars, no umami enhancers, no coloring changers or balancers. None of that is permitted. One of the many rules guarding these products. But let's talk about what can go into the drinks. Now, the main ingredients used to make shochu anyway are sweet potatoes, barley, rice. There's also kokuto sugar, which is this ultra rich, almost unrefined, dark sugar that's made in very far southern, southwestern Japan in the more tropical areas of the country. And then also we have other ingredients such as sesame, which is also, and buckwheat, which are quite popular as well. Those are the main ingredients. And those are the ones that probably comprise over 98% of domestic sales. It's mostly that. Awamori, incidentally, is always made from rice. So there's another rice product. A little bit different from rice shochu, though. We'll get into that later. Now, totally, there are more than 50 permitted ingredients. More than 50. And some of those ingredients are quite interesting. For instance, there is shochu made from green peas. There's also shochu made from water chestnuts. And tea, actually more than one type of tea is permitted. Also, carrots are allowed for making. There is carrot shochu, and yes, it tastes like carrots. We also have shochu made from azuki beans and a lot of other types of grains and other types of beans. And then finally, we have shochu made from cats. Cat shochu is very delicious. No, not cat shochu. It's silver vine. It's called matatabi in Japanese. It's kind of it's catnip on steroids, basically. If you give your cat catnip, they'll be happy for a couple of hours. It's kind of like a drug for cats, right? If you give a cat silver vine, that's a whole weekend that your cat will just be like, oh. They'll be very, very, very happy. Don't give it to your cat. Don't give your cat matatabi shochu either. That's for you to drink, not for the kitty. But it's a very, what I'm trying to say, it's a very, very diverse category, shochu is. And I would argue that it's probably the most diverse spirits category in the world. I'm going to get into the exact reasons why in a moment, but let me just say right now, the magical thing about shochu is that it tastes and it smells like the ingredients it was made from. I know that doesn't sound so crazy, but when you think about it, it actually is remarkable. When you think about whiskey, where does the flavor and aroma come from? It comes from the barrel, right? With shochu, we're focusing on the ingredients. Sweet potato shochu tastes like sweet potatoes. Rice shochu smells and tastes like steamed rice and maybe some ginjo aromas as well, right? Tea shochu smells and tastes exactly like tea. So it's a very, very diverse category with more than 50 different styles. And some of those styles are huge, sweet potato shochu. Now, before I get into some of the comparisons of how, for instance, shochu differs from whiskey, let me talk about some of the GIs, the geographical indications that have already been awarded regionally in Japan. Satsuma shochu. That's sweet potato shochu that is made completely in Kagoshima Prefecture, which used to be called Satsuma. We also have Ryukyu Awamori. And Ryukyu Awamori is the rice spirit that is made in the Okinawan Islands. After that, we also have Kuma shochu. Kuma shochu is rice shochu that is only made in the Hitoyoshi City and Kuma Basin area of southern Kumamoto, way up in the mountains. It's really hidden up there in the mountains of southern Kumamoto, using only rice and water from the springs underneath the Kuma River, which is one of Japan's top 3 fastest flowing rivers. And the water is incredibly pure, it's beautiful. That rice shochu style can only be made by distilleries in that specific location. Finally, we have iki shochu, which is the smallest of these 4. It's small because there's only 7 distilleries that are allowed to make it. Only 7 remain, and they're all on Iki Island. Iki Island is technically part of Nagasaki Prefecture, but in reality, it's closer to Hakata Port. It's closer to the main part of Fukuoka City. So if you ever want to go to Iki, you should go there from Hakata. Anyway, they make a barley shochu with a rice starter fermentation. So it's both. It's rice and barley together. That's iki shochu. 4 GIs. And there are others, of course. There's domestic GI, which is amami kokuto sugar shochu. That's that dark sugar I was talking about. On one small set of islands here in Japan, you can make kokuto shochu. You can't make it anywhere else because it's domestically protected by the Japanese government. There's also, of course, great shochu made in Tokyo on the small island stringing southeast from here. Some very famous shochu brands. There is also a very strong soba shochu or buckwheat shochu tradition in Nagano Prefecture to the west of where we are today. And then, of course, Oita Prefecture has a very famous and very successful barley shochu, 100%, usually 100% barley shochu style. And then going down further south from Oita is Miyazaki Prefecture. And Miyazaki Prefecture basically does almost everything. Up in the north, they do really interesting rice and barley expressions. In the middle section of Miyazaki Prefecture, they do a lot of buckwheat or soba shochu. And then down south, because they're closer to Kagoshima, is where there's a lot of sweet potato production. And incidentally, the best-selling shochu in the world is actually made in Miyazaki Prefecture. So that's kind of the geography of the beautiful expressions that are available to consumers here in Japan. Not a lot of them have made it overseas yet, but hopefully as you learn more about these things and taste more of these drinks yourself and take photos, tell your friends, then there will be more pull for these products, and soon they'll be all over the place in Brazil, I believe. Okay, let's compare shochu and awamori to some other very well-known drinks traditions from around the world, but let's stay in Japan first. How are shochu and awamori different from sake, or nihonshu, or seishu, whatever you want to call it? Well, let's think about how they're similar first. Number 1, they use koji. Koji is important. I'll talk more about koji in a little while. Koji basically converts starch into sugar. Without koji, we don't have sake, we don't have shochu, we don't have awamori, we don't have soy sauce, we don't have miso, we don't have mirin. Japanese culinary culture would be very different without koji. Sake is only made from rice, awamori is only made from rice, so that's similar. But shochu can be made from rice and about 52 other different ingredients, so that's a pretty big difference. The next difference is sake, that's a brewed alcoholic beverage. It's in the same family as wine. It's in the same family as beer. Shochu and awamori are spirits. Same family as cachaça, same family as whiskey, rum, tequila, you name it. So in that sense, they are completely different drinks. A rice shochu and awamori might sometimes remind you a little bit of a sake, or at least a rice shochu will. But you will quickly notice that along with the ginjo aromas, maybe you get a little banana, a little bit of melon, but you also get often a grainier, just a much drier finish to the drink because it's a spirit. Okay, how about shochu and awamori versus soju? Now in America anyway, this is a really hard one for me because Americans anyway tend to think that Korean soju, S-O-J-U, and Japanese shochu, S-H-O-C-H-U, yes, they sound similar. American consumers tend to think they're the same thing. They are not, all right? Why are they different? Well, okay, they're both spirits. However, shochu, honkaku shochu, can only be made using a pot still. That's a rule. A traditional style still. Soju, most of the time, and always for the small green bottle products, is made in a column still. It's a more modern still that is used to make vodka and many other important spirits from all around the world. But soju is basically a pure ethanol, 96% ABV, that is diluted down to somewhere usually lower than 20% alcohol, and then has sweeteners added to it. So several things are different from shochu right there. Number one, you can't use a patent still, a column still, to make premium or authentic shochu and awamori. Also, you can't put any additives in the shochu or the awamori. You can't put sweeteners in there. You can't put acidity enhancers or umami enhancers in there to change the mouthfeel or to change the depth of the spirit. So it's a really pure and very simple spirit, but it's also very difficult to make because you can only use a pot still. One nice thing about a column still is that not only does it give you a very high alcohol percentage, it also removes any kind of strange flavors from the fermentation. So the quality of the fermentation doesn't matter. You just need a high alcohol content in the fermentation, and then the column still will create a super pure, very high ABV product that you can, for soju, as I said, is usually watered down these days to between, 16.5% and 19% most of the time these days. Shochu and awamori, on the other hand, are usually, at least in Japan, bottled at 25% or higher, 25 to up to just under 45%. That's the range. That's the typical range. So those are the basic differences between Japanese shochu and Korean soju. All right, so how about shochu, awamori versus vodka? That's easy. I just kind of explained a lot of it. Vodka's made in a column still. That's not allowed for shochu and awamori. Vodka, as we know, is enjoyed, or it's preferred for cocktail mixing because it is a quote-unquote neutral spirit. It doesn't taste like what it's made from. It tastes like alcohol, right? And it's bottled at 40% or higher, and that's a little higher than most shochu and awamori, which again, I said the low end is 25. That's most of the category. And awamori is usually 30%. So we're talking 25 to 30 is the sweet spot. 40% and up is many other spirits traditions from around the world, kashasa included, which is 38 to 48. So vodka is a neutral spirit. Shochu and awamori, again, they present like the ingredients they're made from. A water chestnut shochu tastes like water chestnuts, right? And a barley shochu is going to taste like barley. It'll be nutty and grainy, sometimes a little bit of honey, sometimes a little toast, sometimes a little bit of, if it's roasted barley, a little coffee, a little chocolate. So they're entirely different styles. And if you ever hear somebody say that shochu, oh, that's Japanese vodka. Really? Have you ever tried vodka before? Now, clearly you haven't tried shochu. That's what I always want to scream when I hear that. Please don't call shochu and awamori vodka. It's rude to the people who make these drinks. And it's probably rude to the vodka makers too. So anyways, they're completely separate. Again, not much similarities there other than the fact that they're both spirits. Okay, shochu and awamori versus cachaça. Cachaça, of course, has a very long history in Brazil. It's the pride of many manufacturers and the people of Brazil, and it's a very important ingredient in some world-famous cocktails these days. One thing that can be quite similar between cachaça and, in particular, kokuto sugar shochu is that they're both made from products that come from cane juice. Now, in the case of kokuto sugar shochu, that is actually made from these bricks of this almost unrefined dark sugar. It is super rich. They don't really pull any of the molasses out of it. So they take the cane juice, they make this really thick, mineral-rich sugar, and then they use that in the second fermentation. In the first fermentation, and this is a rule, all kokuto sugar shochu must use rice koji. So it's rice and then this sugar, which makes it very different from kasasa, which is only the cane juice. Another difference is that kasasa has an ABV range of 38 to 48. Shochu can't be bottled, and neither can awamori. Well, awamoris are a little bit more flexible, but shochu can't be bottled above 45. And again, I said it's usually 25. So shochu and awamori are usually much lower ABV or a bit lower ABV. So that's a very important difference between those two styles. One other importance is the limitations for shochu and awamori in terms of cask aging. Now, kasasa also has cask aging, of course, for some styles, especially the premium styles. For the shochu and awamori makers, there's a limit to how long and how dark their spirits can become. There's a limit for the color of the shochu or awamori, and it's a very strict limit. It's a very tight limit. It's 0.08 on a machine that reads or can identify the darkness of a color. 0.08 is nothing. So it's maybe a light straw color. So because of that limitation, you're rarely going to see, you won't see a shochu or an awamori, at least not a honkaku shochu or a premium shochu or awamori that is anything darker than a straw yellow color or a very, very lightly golden color. It's pretty limited. So even if you have a barley shochu that's been aged in a ex-bourbon cask, for instance, for a few years, the color is going to be very light and it's still going to present like a barley shochu. It's not really going to taste like a whiskey. So that's an important distinction to remember, even when you see a shochu or an awamori with a little bit of color. It's really not going to present that strongly as a whiskey. And speaking of whiskey, let's talk about the differences between whiskey and shochu and awamori right now. Again, there's the limited color factor for the cask aging. And more often, shochu and awamori are aged in either stainless steel tanks or enamel-lined tanks, and then also sometimes in gigantic clay pots. Cask aging is much more recent, and it's not nearly as common as these other styles because it takes up a lot of space, and it's pretty incredibly expensive to start a cask program these days. Whiskey, on the other hand, is pretty much always aged in oak or some other combination of woods, and it's aged for a lot longer than your typical cask-aged shochu or awamori. Also, in terms of whiskey, pot distillation is often used, but it's often used more than once. It's very rare to have a whiskey that's only single pot distilled, and I don't mean that in the Irish sense. I mean it as one pass through a pot still, meaning you have a very low alcohol percentage, but a very high flavor and aroma profile. That almost never happens in whiskey production, but that's the norm in shochu and awamori production. Pot still. You take this beautiful fermentation, you pass it through the pot once. What you have is what you get. What that means is it's very difficult to make a good shochu or a good awamori. It's much harder because you have to have a super delicious fermentation. If you don't have a delicious fermentation, you won't have a delicious product. One pass through a pot still, it won't erase those mistakes. But if you use the pot still again and again and again, you get something that's much lighter with a higher alcohol content. You see how this works? So vodka, which is in a patent still is distilled to extreme alcohol levels, very low or no flavor or aroma. Opposite is shochu and awamori. Only limited distillation, but extreme flavors and aromas. That's basically how shochu and awamori are so unique in all of these drinks I've talked about today. And it's also why having one shochu is never going to be enough, because there's so much variety. Whiskey, no disrespect intended, but all whiskeys smell and taste like whiskey. However, if you have a sweet potato shochu and a rice shochu and a barley, a kokuto, and a buckwheat shochu side by side, you won't be able to say that any one of them tastes like the other, right? They're all shochu, but they are all unique. And that's some of the magic of this category. All right, so let me talk a little bit about koji very briefly. I said before, koji converts starches into sugars. No koji, we don't have shochu and we don't have awamori. Now, shochu and awamori are not made from fruit. Fruit has sugar, right? Awamori and shochu are usually made from tubers, grains, and other vegetable products, with the addition of kokuto sugar, which is the one outlier. But as I said before, the primary fermentation for kokuto sugar shochu production is rice. So you need koji. Koji will take the starches in rice, in sweet potatoes, in barley, and act like scissors. They're like scissors. They cut those starches into simple soluble sugars, glucose. Yeast loves sugar, and yeast can't handle starch. So koji and yeast work as a team, side by side, during the fermentation. The koji cuts the starches into sugars, and the yeast eats those sugars and makes alcohol, which we want, and also carbon dioxide and a lot of heat. So you have to keep the fermentation cool. There are three major types of koji used to make shochu. Yellow, black, and white are the easy ways to remember them. Maybe you know that yellow koji is used almost exclusively in the sake industry, and actually black is the only permitted style allowed in the awamori production industry. But shochu has a lot of flexibility. Shochu can use all three. There are no limitations. And actually, they express very differently. Yellow koji tends to give a bit more fruit and floral qualities, or at least it elevates those in the product. White koji is somewhere in the middle, and often with a nice clean finish to it. And then black koji will have a lot of earthier or heavier elements, but also a really nice subtle sweetness to it. It's fascinating how radically different the shochu can be depending on the koji used. Okay, so how are these drinks made? Let me put this incredibly simply. I'm going to focus on shochu, and then I'll tell you how awamori is slightly different. You can see that, generally speaking, there's a two-step fermentation. Okay, we have the starter fermentation, sometimes called the primary fermentation, and that's where you have usually rice, although sometimes barley or a different ingredient, and the koji that has been propagated onto that rice, and then yeast and water. That's your starter fermentation. This is designed to give the yeast a head start. It's designed to create a very healthy, very active yeast culture. After several days, you divide that primary fermentation up into other tanks or other pots, and then you add the quote-unquote main ingredient. So if you're making kokuto sugar shochu, it would be rice koji in the primary fermentation, and then that caked dark sugar in the second fermentation, or the main fermentation. Sweet potato is similar. Rice and then sweet potatoes. Barley, if it's iki shochu, would be rice and then barley. If it's barley shochu from Oita, it'll be barley, barley. And rice shochu, of course, is rice, rice. So just depends on the style that you're going for. That second fermentation, often between 10 days. If it's a really cold fermentation, it might be closer to 2 or 3, it'll be over 2 weeks, maybe closer to 3 weeks. Depends on the brand, depends on the distillery, depends on the goals of the master brewer distiller or the toji. And then when it's just right, when the fermentation is perfect, then it's time to distill. And that gets moved into the pot still that's over on the right side. One time through the pot still, and you have a pretty low alcohol percentage for shochu, usually somewhere between 37 and 43 is often what it will come off the still at. And awamori is the same. And then you have many choices. How are you going to age it? How are you going to filter it? How much do you wish to dilute it, if at all? And then it gets bottled and it gets sent off to the consumer through the sales channel. There are, of course, two major styles of distillation in the premium space. One of them is the traditional style, which is an atmospheric pot distillation. And then the newer style, which has been around for several decades now and is used to make lighter or softer expressions, is called vacuum distillation. And that requires a modern pot still where you can make a vacuum inside of it and reduce the boiling point and the vapor point of the fermented mash inside. So both are present in the market. It doesn't always say whether it's atmospheric or vacuum distilled. Atmospheric, sweet potato shochu, and awamori almost always, atmospheric distilled, right? Vacuum distilled, a lot of Oita barley shochu, a lot of rice shochu, a lot of kokuto sugar shochu is vacuum distilled. So often it's more of an ingredient question than it is an actual brand by brand decision. All right, last question. How are these drinks enjoyed in Japan? There are many, many different ways. And this is one of the beautiful things of these drinks is you just need to pick the style that suits your taste best or suits the ingredient best, right? So on the rocks, very, very common today, especially in the cities. In cocktail culture, we love whiskey and other spirits with a little bit of ice, or some people do anyway. Surprisingly, not so many people drink shochu and awamori straight. It's just not very common. One reason is because shochu and awamori are usually consumed with food. And we need to bring the ABV down a little bit so that it doesn't destroy the flavors and aromas of the food that we're eating. So a lot of dilution is common. For instance, mizuwari, which is rocks with water added to it. And this is a great way to enjoy a drink that you want to bring down to wine ABV or Nihonshu ABV. It's also good for the summer months. But in the winter months, you might want to add hot water. So shochu plus hot water, and then you have a beautiful cold weather drink that goes very well with a number of dishes that are enjoyed during the winter months. So a couple of kind of old school styles right there. There's also sodawari, which is basically sparkling water and ice, and then your shochu or awamori, very, very common today. Finally, we've got cocktails, which in Japan will often be called chuhai, and this is, to a greater extent, this is actually a different type of shochu called korui, which is basically almost a neutral shochu, and it has fruit juice and often sparkling water added to it. It's really interesting though, because outside of Japan, anything called a chuhai right now is actually usually made with honkaku shochu or a more expensive awamori. So it's a slightly different trend that's going on. Both are great. Finally, there's also a very old school way of doing shochu and awamori, which is called mae wari. Mae means before, wari means cut or mix. And it's where people would basically mix shochu 50-50 with spring water and leave it overnight, leave it for 2 days, and then heat it up and drink it with friends a couple days later. Very soft, really smooth, lovely way to drink it. In terms of introducing these drinks to your friends or if you're trying to educate somebody about them, just think about what they normally drink. Do they drink wine? Send them this way. Do they normally drink whiskey? Okay, give them this suggestion. Whiskey, you've got barrel-aged barley shochu. That's an easy one. Do they drink kashasa? Okay, there you go, kokuto sugar shochu. Give that a try. I like to start from what people normally enjoy and then try to give them an easy entry point into the world of shochu and awamori. Also, in terms of food pairings that I mentioned before, my good friend chef Mark Matsumoto said one time, and I'll never forget, that there's really no bad pairings because shochu and awamori don't really have any acidity. It's not like wine, where sometimes it'll be perfect, and then other times the wine and the food fight. Shochu and awamori generally don't fight with the food, which means that you can pretty safely enjoy them with whatever you're having. Having said that, some things work better than others. Rice shochu, of course, I wouldn't want to drink that with a really heavy meat preparation with a really heavy sauce. But conversely, maybe sweet potato shochu, which tends to be super aromatic and rich, maybe you wouldn't want to eat that with your salad. So take those things into consideration. Anyways, hopefully through these 4 questions that I've just gone through today, and thanks to the Japan Sake and Shochu Makers Association, which has provided so much of this content for you in written format as well, you may now have the tools to more easily approach this very, very diverse and very historic category. One of Japan's best kept secrets. I mean, think about this. There is more shochu and awamori made in Japan than tequila in Mexico. It's no joke. Most, or maybe 2/3 of tequila is exported out of Mexico. Only 1/3 stays domestically. Shochu and awamori, less than 1% is exported at this point. It really is Japan's best kept secret. But please help me change that. Tell everybody, tell your friends, take photos, put them online. Talk to people about how you enjoyed these drinks, where you enjoyed these drinks, and get other people interested. Again, if you have any questions for me, hit me up. I'm very, very easily accessible online, as is the JSS. They've got a very, very informative website, and also I encourage you to listen to the Sake on Air podcast, where we discuss in great detail Japan's kokushu, Japan's best kept secrets. Thank you very much.